kind of spun off of my video where I tried to determine who the Superman mentioned in Batman and Robin might be. Check that video out if you want. When I was growing up, I always saw these 4 Batman movies all taking place in the same world, mostly because we've got the same actors playing Alfred and Commissioner Gordon. But even further, Val Kilmer and Chase Meridian kind of mention Catwoman. Val Kilmer says his parents were killed by a maniac, which I suppose you could say is not a direct reference to the Joker, but I think we all know that is what they were referencing. It wasn't until I started exploring the comic side of YouTube when I first heard people suggest Forever and Robin were set in a different universe, mostly because it's a different tone in those movies that doesn't gel with the Burton movies. This explanation never worked for me for a few reasons. One, in the comics, we went from a fairly grim, pulp-inspired tone in the early appearances to a much more colorful, sillier interpretation of the characters and world. But at the time, that was all meant to be one world. It wasn't until much later when they said at some vague point the early Batman appearances were on one world and the later ones were on another. And 2, even in the Burton movies, you go from a movie that has a plot I admit I don't just love, it kind of falls apart when you realize even the biggest metropolitan areas aren't self-sustained with their own beauty supplies. They would import soap and shampoo from other cities instead of relying on what they knew the Joker poisoned. But that plot is downright reasonable when you get to mind-controlled cyborg penguins and Oswald somehow magically getting the blueprints to the Batmobile. So the idea of tonally these movies don't match, they must be set in a different world, that never worked for me. But it apparently worked for enough people to become official. That's right, legally speaking, these are not the same Batman. When Val almost mentions Catwoman and Joker, he's mentioning something similar to what happened in the Burton movies, but not the exact incidents we saw. We have Batman Resurrection, a novel by John Jackson Miller meant to bridge the gap between the 1989 movie and Batman Returns. We have a brief cameo from Norman Plinkis, this universe's version of the Riddler, who works at the Gotham Gazette with Alexander Knox. He only briefly appears in Resurrection and will play a bigger part in the sequel, Batman Revolution. But what little we've seen of him in Resurrection, it doesn't seem like there's any way to reconcile this Riddler with the Jim Carrey version in Batman Forever. I suppose you could say Plinkis gets the ball rolling on the idea and look of the Riddler, explaining why Edward Nygma has Riddler merchandise before he becomes the Riddler. But no, it's pretty clear in Batman Forever, nobody has used that pseudonym before. Then in the Batman 89 comics by Sam Hamm and Joe Quinones, which are meant to be a follow-up to the 2 Burton movies, Billy D. Williams' Harvey Dent becomes Two-Face. You might say, big deal. The Adam West Batman series had a Catwoman who swapped race depending on the episode, but it's maybe the same character, possibly. They at least don't mention that she's a different Catwoman. True, but then at the end of the Batman 89 comic series, Two-Face dies, seemingly precluding this being the origin of the Tommy Lee Jones Two-Face. So that's it. If you accept these stories as officially being part of the Burton movie timeline, then Forever and Robin cannot possibly take place later in that timeline. I mean, I guess anything's possible. You could rationalize that the 89 version of Ra's al Ghul revived Two-Face, or Edward Nygma has partial amnesia and has merchandise of Norman Plinkis, but didn't remember he called himself the Riddler, nor did this reporter. But no, I think at this point I have to swallow my pride and accept that these movies exist in different worlds. But what do you all think? Is this evidence pretty darning, or do you ignore it and only accept what we see in the movies? Let me know, and that's it for today. I'll see everyone with something else in the future. In the meantime, have a good one.